Hi students, let's talk about deviant behavior again. And this time let's look at a concept called a social control. It's a key component about deviant behavior. Since this chapter is actually deviance and crime, there's a lot of social controls in place that are organized methods, there's processes, there's law enforcement, there's all kinds of stuff that's in place in society to try to monitor folks to make sure that you are walking the straight and narrow instead of stepping out of the norm. So that's essentially what a social control is. It's any method that a society has in place to try to keep you on the straight and narrow, to discourage you from doing things that society considers to be deviant, and rather encourage you to do things that are on the acceptable side of norms. Look at my gorgeous artwork down here again. You might remember this picture that's similar to one I drew earlier in the semester when we were talking about norms for the first time. So you can't really fully understand what deviance is unless you go back and you review that concept of norms from chapter 2. So norms are rules about social behavior, but there's two sides to the coin. There are rules about what is acceptable in society, and there are rules about what is clearly not acceptable in society, but there's always a gray area because there's behaviors in society that might not be tried yet, and so we don't really know until somebody tries it whether it's going to be okay or not. And back when we were talking about norms and trying to decide whether behavior was okay or not okay, we learned a term called sanctions. And so sanctions and social controls, those two concepts kind of go together here. Because in formal situations where people violate laws, remember, laws are one of the three types of norms that you need to review just to understand this chapter, but also because the midterm test is coming up at the end of this week. But laws are a particular type of norm that is written down. So it's formal rules about what you can and can't do. And it's also formal punishments about what will happen to you if you go ahead and do it anyway, though the law says not to. And so sanctions can be formal like that, but it can also be a punishment that on an informal basis, a parent gives to a child during their socialization process. And so when we talk about social controls and deviant behavior, we talk about social control being internal to the person, but also external to the person in society at large. The internal to the person situation would be those rules about social values like right or wrong or good and beautiful that we are supposed to get guidance about in our individual socialization process. So when we learn during our upbringing, up through our entire lives as we are in our learning process, we internalize those ideas about what is or is not acceptable behavior. Think back to George Herbert Mead when we were talking about a significant other versus a generalized other. The significant other, that immediate person in our caregiving small micro realm, we have a vested interest ourselves. We want to please that person typically because we benefit from that emotionally, economically, whatever. Typically we are interested in pleasing that significant other. But as we age and we realize our individual positions within a larger, in our case, global world, we perhaps look at the ways in which our actions can affect, in general, the outside world. And there are external social controls in place that are formalized, such as a police force getting a ticket for speeding or jaywalking or whatever, or punishing you for manslaughter should you accidentally take someone's life. These are not behaviors that are condoned in our society, and therefore there are external social controls, sanctions for violating norms such as that are in place in our society to discourage deviant behavior and instead get you to think twice if it crossed your mind to begin with and stay on the non-deviant path or the acceptable side of norms. Now, Not every single behavior is part of every single society. Remember, culture is different from one place to the next. Norms are different from one place to the next. So how do we know if a behavior one place is going to be acceptable in this place? Well, you can try it out and see what the sanction is. So for instance, there are many cultures, I know some of you are culinary and hospitality students, there are many cultures all over the world, from Asia to Europe and the Southern Hemisphere too, that eat horse meat. Horses have a ton of meat on them, and there's a whole lot of food insecurity in the world. But in our minds in the United States, typically we have a gross reaction or a shocked reaction to the idea of eating horses because they symbolize something else in our lives. They are pets, they are allies in winning the West, they help us in wars, they do all kinds of beneficial things for humanity outside of the stomach, and we've never defined them as food. However, there's a lot of poverty and a lot of food insecurity. So what would the U.S. population say ultimately about horse meat being included in the meat counter at Kroger with a USDA inspection sticker on it, like Angus cattle get, right? Or even buffalo get, that kind of thing, lamb, those kinds of things that you can find. So these kinds of behaviors that exist in human societies other places, would they fit with us? Well, we could try it and see how people react on an informal way and see if people with power enact laws so that there are also external social controls that prohibit us from eating those kinds of things, or at least selling them legally, for instance. So deviance and social controls, there's a whole lot of focus on trying to discourage deviance in society, but we are going to look in the next two lectures, short lectures I hope, because I know the first one was a doozy, I didn't mean to do that to you, but in the next two lectures we're going to look at the role deviance has in society from a functionalist point of view. That's right, I said functionalism. Go back to chapter 1 and look at your notes from that. That is the theory, the glasses that you put on, where you look at everything in society as though it has a stabilizing, orderly effect on the social system as a whole. And so many times functionalists look at deviance, or if you don't have a lot of practice applying functionalism yet, you might look at deviance and say, well, that sounds destabilizing. That sounds unbeneficial for society. However, that deviant behavior that gets punished by a society, that deviant behavior that sanctions are imposed on that deviant behavior, that, according to a functionalist point of view, can clarify what the acceptable side of norms are. If there's a behavior in here in this gray area and we don't know will it be acceptable or not, well, if someone does it, or if a group of people begin to practice that behavior and society sanctions it negatively and there are social controls put in place to prevent that behavior from happening again, well, that clears up some of the gray area for us. And that's a wonderful stabilizing thing for society from a functionalist perspective. Also, from a functionalist perspective, deviance can unite groups or make groups feel like a solid subculture. I have a sisterhood with these people because we have a common social experience, or I have a brotherhood with these people because there's a common history that we share. And so these kinds of, you can unite groups and have a feeling of unity and solidarity among people with similar dispositions and like-mindedness. And deviant behavior can clarify where the transition points are between the you and the me, right? The otherness. That also is a stabilizing, calming effect on society, according to a functionalist point of view. And also, does society stay the same over time, or does it change? I can't remember what we said about that way back in chapter 2 when we first asked that question. Well, the answer is it changes a lot over time. And a functionalist says that social change is a stabilizing factor. You would not be content as a generation if life today was exactly the same as it was for grandma. Would you be content? Think about it for a second. No, you have your own social identity as your generation with new technology, new innovations, farther developed globalization so that you have communication and economic and commerce pathways all over the world. And this is a different world than grandma. And so deviant behavior is one of those things that causes change to happen in society over time. And functionalists say that's a wonderfully stabilizing thing because it controls discontent that one generation might have compared to the next as time passes. Think about the civil rights era. There was a ton of social change that happened there, and you and I would not be content with the governing structure. Some people are still not content with the governing structure if that civil rights legislation had not been imposed and used as an external form of social control to change behavior toward a more stabilizing, acceptable situation. So functionalism has a lot to say about deviance, and it's not all bad, even though we want to control, or we have social controls to look at. But let's look at deviance on the macro scale from a functionalist point of view in the next video, and then the one after that, let's look at it from a conflict point of view in terms of the haves versus the have-nots, the powerful imposing their rules on a powerless other group that doesn't have a voice in policymaking. And hopefully this will be interesting and fun with a lot of opportunities for outside sources. So text me with questions, please. Bye.